A quiet town, a smiling nurse, a horrifying secret. The image is simple enough to fit on a handbill. Children playing in a sunlit yard, a young woman bending with a soft smile to tie a pinafore, the ordinary rhythms of domestic life in a colonial street. In Van Diemen's Land in 1852, Hobart's streets were not always gentle, but appearances mattered. Households kept up facades of order, the way families kept up fires. Behind some doors, however, ruin and strain had woven themselves into the fabric of everyday life. This is the story of one of those doors, and of the young woman who stood by it. Mary Sullivan, a nursemaid whose outward calm would not protect her from a community's need for answers. Mary was born in County Cork, Ireland, in the shadow of the famine and the mass dislocations it left in its wake. Like many of her generation, her childhood was shaped by scarcity and the drift of families seeking better prospects, some by emigration, others by desperate measures at home. When she was convicted of stealing a quilt, the punishment that followed was not a mere fine or a short sentence. It was transportation. The British justice system, strained and severe, sent thousands of women like Mary across oceans to Van Diemen's Land to labor as domestic servants and caregivers in settler households. The crime itself, small in some worldly scale, became a passport to a colony where survival depended more on placement and patronage than on youth or innocence. Mary arrived in Hobart on May 27, 1852. She was a convict in a new world, assigned not to a factory or a field, but to domestic service. In the households of the colony, women convicts were pressed into the intimate labor of care, washing, cooking, mending, and, crucially, tending the children. The term nurse in that era did not mean a trained practitioner of medicine. In most private homes it meant nursemaid, the person who watched the youngest, who rocked a cradle and dried a brow. In the Langley household, Mary's role was precisely this: nursemaid, caregiver, a presence expected to be both unobtrusive and always present. The Langley home was a modest one, tucked among similar dwellings where newly arrived workers and families lived side by side. Mrs. Emma Jane Langley ran the house, and the family relied on hired servants to keep the household functioning. The Fraser family lived nearby. Mr. Fraser was away, as so many men were at that time, seeking gold in the rugged country beyond Hobart, while Mrs. Fraser was unwell and bedridden. The Fraser household depended upon neighbors and hired help to watch over their two young children, the younger of whom was Adeline Clara Blackburn Fraser, known as Addie, a toddler of about 2 years. When a mother's illness and a father's absence coincided, the fragile safety net of neighbors and domestic labor strained. Life for a transported woman in this setting was precarious in ways both visible and invisible. Convict status carried a social stigma that limited sympathy. Living in someone else's home left a woman's fate tied to the goodwill or the impatience of her employers. Rumors circulated easily in small towns. Whispers hardened into accusations more quickly than facts could be gathered. Mary's presence in the Fraser household as a nursemaid placed her inside the most vulnerable space in the colony. The room where a child asleep in a cot was as dependent as any newborn on the steadiness and attention of those around her. If this history feels at once remote and oddly familiar, that is because the dynamics, displacement, vulnerability, dependence, are human constants. There is a particular cruelty when systems meant to regulate and punish also send fragile people into care roles that demand trust. It is difficult, even now, to look back at that social arrangement and not see risks. If this early context intrigues you, leave a comment on what surprised you most about convict life and the roles assigned to women in the colony, and stay with the story to learn the strange turn that followed. On the morning of July 7th, routine unraveled. The household noticed small things missing: bread that should have been on the table, the tin of tea, the bag of sugar. These were the trifle losses that sometimes mark poverty as much as malice. Mary was seen leaving the house that morning. She walked out with a bundle, or so witnesses later recalled. Other accounts described her as simply going across a yard. For a little while no one thought more of it than of a servant running an errand. Then a search began for Adeline. The child was found in a water butt, The discovery was sudden and devastating. Dr. Huxtable, the examining physician called to the scene, testified to his findings in calm but unflinching terms. The child had died of strangulation by a wire cord. The time of death was estimated at roughly 4 hours prior to the examination. Those details were clinical, but they arrived like a collision in a small community. The press later reported the bare facts with a mixture of horror and the eager appetite of newspapers for public tragedy. In the days that followed, investigations assembled as they could. Witnesses were called, household servants questioned, and the fragments of ordinary domestic life were gathered as evidence. The physical evidence that became central to the case was minimal but telling. A torn piece of a petticoat was found, its hem showing a broken wire that, upon comparison, matched the wire cord around the child's neck. To modern ears, the detail is both precise and chilling. A length of wire used perhaps to fasten clothing, stripped from the underpinnings of a dress or petticoat. In the colonial household, clothing repairs were carried out with whatever materials were at hand. Wire, used to support or fasten, might be scissored into place or repurposed a dozen times. The petticoat fragment, the cord, the match. These items formed the central physical narrative that would drive the inquiry and then the trial. Witness testimony filled in the social texture around these fragments. Mrs. Langley and other household members recounted Mary as generally quiet, sometimes withdrawn, and occasionally subject to what they described as fits or strange episodes. Mary Ann Palmer, another servant in the vicinity, provided accounts that suggested Mary's comportment was not always steady, though the language used at the time, unsettled, peculiar, must be read with care. Mrs. Burton and other neighbors reported that Mary did not call attention to herself. She did not boast or parade. Detective Constable Chandler, leading the investigation, assembled these observations alongside the physical clues and the pattern of movement on that morning. An arrest followed. The inquest convened with the gravity of legal institutions on display, a coroner's jury, formal testimony, the reading of evidence. Inquests, in the colonial context, were designed to determine cause and inform whether a prosecution was warranted. Dr. Huxtable's conclusion of strangulation by wire, combined with the torn petticoat fragment and the sequence of Mary's observed departures from the house, gave the coroner grounds to commit her for trial. The colony, small and tightly connected, watched closely. The press described the scene in measured tones, noting the community's shock at a child's death and the swiftness with which suspicion gathered around the young nursemaid. When the case reached the courtroom, the contrast between the domestic intimacy of the crime and the public solemnity of the legal stage became stark. Courtrooms in mid-19th century Hobart were spaces where social order was both performed and enforced. They were not forums of equal representation. Legal counsel was often absent for those who could not afford it, and the norms that protect defendants today, robust defense, forensic standards, cautious appeals to doubt, were less established. Mary entered that court at a disadvantage not only because she was a young convict from Ireland, but because she lacked advocacy that could have reframed evidence or interrogated assumptions. The prosecution's case emphasized the physical link between the petticoat fragment and the wire found at the scene. Witnesses detailed their observations. The tone in the courtroom could be read in the small moments, a mother fainting when the child's death was described, audible intakes of breath in the gallery, jurors folding their hands and staring. Mary's own silence was noted. Whether this silence was stoicism, a consequence of shock, lack of comprehension, or something else, no conclusive claim can be made beyond observation. The law witnessed her apparent reticence and placed its own weight upon it. The jury returned a verdict of guilty. The judge pronounced sentence, death by hanging. In a colony accustomed to harsh punishments, executions had lost none of their finality. The sentence landed with a particular intensity because of Mary's youth, she was 16, and because the victim was a toddler. The public reaction threaded grief with a desire for order restored, and in that desire a complex moral arithmetic took shape. An accused person, a dead child, a community demanding closure. After the verdict, the case did not end in the simple arc of conviction to execution. Reports emerged that complicated the picture, or at least introduced alternate framings that some felt obliged to consider. There were claims that Mary had previously been confined in an asylum, or that she had exhibited fits of insanity before the tragedy. Appeals were lodged on the grounds that her mental state had not been properly assessed, that she might not have been of sound mind at the time of the act. A medical board reviewed the records and testimonies that had been assembled. Contemporary observers in the colony debated the significance of these claims. Newspapers printed letters and editorials weighing mercy against the demands of justice. It is crucial, given the passage of time and the limits of 19th-century record-keeping, to state such claims with caution. The term insanity in Victorian parlance covered a vast terrain, from epilepsy and convulsive disorders to melancholia and fits of transient delirium. The asylum itself, for many, was a place of last resort rather than a nuanced therapeutic environment. To say that reports suggested prior confinement in an asylum is to record what was claimed in the contemporaneous sources. It is not to assert a modern psychiatric diagnosis. The medical board ultimately declared Mary to be of sound mind for the purposes of law, and the appeals did not save her from the sentence. On August 5, 1852, the sentence was carried out. She was hanged. The account of the execution remained factual and restrained in the official record. A young woman, a convict, executed according to the law of the time. The colony registered its response in conflicting ways, some with relief that a legal process had reached what they considered an end, others with unease and lingering questions about the harshness of transportation and punishment, and about what protections the law afforded to the vulnerable. The name Mary Sullivan was recorded alongside dates and places, but the lived interiority of a 16-year-old girl, her fears, her past privations, her thoughts in the weeks leading up to that morning, was lost to most direct verification. In assessing this case from our vantage, three things stand out. First, the structural conditions. The system of transportation that displaced young women and placed them into private households with minimal oversight. Those arrangements made for efficient labor allocation. They did not always provide safety nets or legal support. Second, the evidentiary pattern. The centrality of a small but striking physical match. The petticoat fragment and the wire, around which narrative certainty clustered. Third, the social environment. Rumor, stigma, and press attention that amplified suspicion and narrowed the space for doubt. Yet the story resists a tidy moral. It is possible to accept the jury's verdict while still asking whether the mechanisms of that verdict were fair by any standard we would today endorse. A young convented woman in a new colony, unrepresented, with a community eager for explanation. These are not conditions that favor careful exculpation. The coroner's finding, the doctor's testimony, the matching wire. These are the pieces that produced a judicial outcome. They are not, however, a narrative that explains inner motive or provides a full account of mental state. The historical record does not grant us those intimacies. What it does give us are fragments, dates, physical items, recorded testimonies, and the quiet notice of a life extinguished. The image of a smiling nursemaid remains a powerful and uneasy one. A smile does not equal innocence. It does not equal guilt. The colonial press used that sort of image readily, because contrasts, smile and horror, make for gripping copy. But the more lasting contrast is institutional, the convivial domesticity of the household against the cold instruments of coercive power that transported and then disciplined the poor. The nursemaid's role, tender, invisible, necessary, exposed her to risks not only of overwork, but of swift moral condemnation. There are other things to consider. The death of a child in a small town is a communal trauma. Grief gathers quickly and makes moral categories sharper. In any era, communities look for causes and culprits. In 1850s Hobart, where social bonds were dense and newspapers carried the news to every corner, the public appetite for clarity could become a force unto itself. The law, meant to mediate between accusation and truth, can in such moments become a means of reasserting order rather than an instrument of nuanced adjudication. At the center, of course, is human vulnerability. Mary was a young woman shaped by famine, displacement, and coercive law. Addie was a toddler who depended on adults for every breath and step. The colonial machine, transportation and assignment, inquest and trial, execution, moved implacably around these frailties. The case is not merely a list of legal outcomes, it is an index of how institutions respond when society is hurt and frightened. Historians and readers have debated cases like this for generations. Some emphasize the procedural fault lines, the lack of defense counsel, the power imbalance between employer testimony and an accused servant, the weight given to circumstantial matches. Others focus on the social story, how poverty and displacement correlate with criminalization, how women's labor in private homes is undervalued until the rarest of catastrophes occurs. Still others return to the human story, asking, for example, how we might understand a young girl's nervousness, or how the label of insanity shifted public sympathy back and forth. It is important to resist the temptation to fill gaps with neat motives or sensational reconstructions. We do not know, in any reliable way, what passed through Mary Sullivan's mind as she left the Langley house on that morning. We cannot reconstruct a private conversation or a hidden plan beyond what testimony provided. We can, however, examine the recorded facts and the environment in which they were interpreted. We can weigh the physical evidence, a length of wire and a torn garment, against the social patterns of a penal colony where appearances and rumors had outsized influence. There are lessons in that weighing. Systems that move people across oceans as punishment often do not account for the care that must sustain life afterwards. When the state exports labor, it does not always accept responsibility for the long-term welfare of those it displaces. The law of the time treated a young woman like a discrete case, but the moral questions cast a wider net. Who bears responsibility for safety in households that rely on vulnerable labor? What obligations did employers have to protect and to advocate for the convicts in their care? How did the stigma of conviction alter the balance of credibility when an accused servant stood in the dock? The answers are complicated. In the immediate instance, the court rendered a verdict based on the evidence and interpretations available to it. The execution followed the sentence. In the long run, however, the case contributed to a broader conversation about transportation, about the management of female convicts, and about the limits of 19th-century psychiatric understanding. Debates about asylum treatment, about legal representation for the poor, and about the protections, or lack thereof, for women in domestic service all continued well beyond this single tragic episode. We are left with images that insist on being remembered. The quiet street where a child once played, the nursemaid who smiled and was later arraigned, the small metallic piece of evidence that altered many lives. We are also left with questions that cannot be conclusively answered. Was justice served? Perhaps in the narrow legal sense it was, according to the standards and processes of the time. Was it fair by any measure that takes into account power imbalances and the limited resources of a convicted teenager? That is a harder conclusion to reach. Did the colony fail to provide safeguards for those it imported as labor? The systemic answer seems clearer in the negative. There is a human urge when faced with such a case to assign a simple verdict, guilty or innocent, sane or mad, system vindicated or system failed. The historical record resists such simple closures. It forces us, instead, to live with complexity, to hold the facts up and measure them, to acknowledge grief and the need for accountability, and to recognize the limits of what can be known. That restraint is not neutrality in the moral sense. It is a refusal to let the hunger for resolution erase the ambiguities of human life. In the quiet of the years that followed, the streets of Hobart resumed their rhythms. New arrivals came, children grew and played, and families continued. The name Mary Sullivan persisted in the record, a convict, a defendant, a young woman executed, and the little child, Adeline, persisted as a tender grief in the pages of local memory. For the town, the case served as a mirror. It reflected the fragility of domestic arrangements, the readiness of society to judge, and the ways institutions both protect and punish. If you look at the facts, the arrival on May 22, 1852, the incident on July 7th, the medical finding of strangulation by a wire, the torn petticoat fragment, the inquest and trial, the claims of prior asylum confinement, the review by a medical board, the final decision proclaiming her of sound mind. The execution on August 5, 1852, what emerges is less a simple moral drama and more a study of system and circumstance. Mary was 16 at the time of her death. Addie was 2. Between those ages stretched a sequence of legal decisions, social pressures, and the merciless need of a colony for order. We should resist using the word secret to imply some shadowy conspiracy. There is no evidence that such a thing existed. Rather, the secret is of a softer, more painful order. The hidden lives of transported women, the private anxieties that do not make it fully into testimony, the interior distress that escapes the instruments of law. That is the secret that the title points to. Not necessarily a single concealed act, but a constellation of vulnerabilities concealed within a town that otherwise looked quiet and orderly. History offers no easy consolations, but it offers perspective. Cases like Mary Sullivan's are reminders of the human consequences of policy decisions, the ways laws and economies place bodies in situations where risk is concentrated. They remind us that legal outcomes are shaped by social narratives and by the availability of advocacy. They press us to ask how compassion and justice can coexist, and how systems can be adjusted to protect the dependent without defaulting to punishment as the only response. The image returns: a quiet town, a smiling nurse, a horrifying secret. Let it stand as both a historical snapshot and an ethical provocation. What do we expect of care? What do we owe those we judge? How much trust do we place in appearances? The case of Mary Sullivan and little Addie Fraser invites us to examine the edges of those questions. Share what struck you most about this story in the comments. What surprised you about convict life, or about how evidence and social context intersected in this case? Was the outcome inevitable given the times, or could the colony have done better by its most vulnerable? Subscribe for more untold colonial cases and, when you do, tell us. Did you see Mary as guilty, as someone who suffered from mental distress beyond contemporary understanding, or as a victim of a system that moved too harshly and without adequate safeguards? Your thoughts keep the conversation with history alive.